altitude gauges, but none had instruments that displayed aircraft orientation with respect to the ground. As a consequence, many pilots were killed while relying on their natural instincts that they believed were a better guide than instruments. In 1926, Ocker invented a device that forever changed aviation. Initially called the Ocker-Myers Vertigo Stopper Box, the contraption featured a turn indicator, compass, artificial horizon, and penlight rigged inside a covered shoebox with a viewing hole cut in one end. The box was mounted to a Barony chair, a single-axis spinning device used in early pilot training that demonstrated that the human vestibular system can be fooled.
It had been firmly established that individuals who were placed in a revolving chair and rotated for a few turns invariably replied after the chair was gently stopped that they had started to turn in the opposite direction of prior motion. The tendency of an individual's senses to play him false in a situation of this kind is the result of induced vertigo. General Malcolm Crowe.
Ocker's box had dramatically shown that vertigo can be overcome by relying on flight instruments. He further reinforced his case for instrument flight when he also invented in 1926 the hooded cockpit for blind flying. In essence, he put the Ocker box concept to practical use aloft. He rigged an open cockpit plane by covering the pilot's seat with canvas to simulate fog or night flying. The instructor pilot seat was kept uncovered. The hooded cockpit allowed pilots to experience spatial illusions in all three dimensions through which an aircraft moves in flight: horizontal, lateral, and vertical. Despite his revolutionary inventions, most airmen remained unconvinced, a consequence of official skepticism. Senior Air Corps detractors claimed the flight instruments were not needed, were dangerous, and would not be part of any pilot training program. Undeterred, Ocker was obsessed with convincing disbelievers. However, his campaign to educate pilots about instrument flight was met with resistance, ridicule, and accusations that Ocker was, in fact, insane.
His crusade was not without its crucifixions, and prior to his death, his crown was one of thorns. Twice he was hospitalized for sanity tests. He later joked that he was the only Air Corps officer who had 2 letters to prove he was sane. Colonel Carl Crane.
When Ocker arrived at Brooks Field on July 16, 1929, he found in Carl Crane a kindred spirit. Crane had become a blind flying believer after inadequate flight instruments nearly led to his death when his plane spiraled in a cloud bank in 1926.
He was working here at Brooks, getting this hood put on the airplane, and another officer, Colonel William Ocker, who was that Major William Ocker at the time, was assigned to Brooks Air Force Base, and he walked into the hangar one day when Carl was doing this work and said that, asked him what he was doing. And he said, well, he was putting this hood on so he could try and figure out what the problem was that was causing people to crash in bad weather. He and Colonel Ocker, after that, worked together on teaching people to fly in bad weather.
At Brooks Field, they pioneered the development of flight instrument training. Ocker and Crane dramatically demonstrated to pilots that their senses were unreliable, even on the ground. They blindfolded pilots and had them try to walk a straight line across an open field. While performing this action, the blindfolded men were also asked to sprinkle whitewash from buckets that they carried to mark their course. This technique was modified using sand, but produced the same expected results.
The pilots carried sandbags on their backs. The instructor would then punch holes in the sacks. John W. Stutz.
The whitewash and sand provided a visual trail of how far off course the pilots had walked while blindfolded. Homing pigeons were also used to show pilots that birds too could be disoriented in flight. Using Bull Durham tobacco pouches to blindfold them, the pigeons were tossed from an airplane. They became disoriented in their spiral nosedive to the ground. Ocker noted to once skeptical pilots that even pigeons refuse to fly in fog when they cannot see. To prove his unwavering belief in blind flying, Ocker took a giant leap of faith in the technology he had developed. He was motivated to do so after Jimmy Doolittle became the first pilot in history to fly on instruments only in September 1929. Doolittle's feat, which involved flying a 15-mile course from Long Island's Mitchell Field, paled in comparison to what Ocker planned. On June 24, 1930, Ocker took off in his hooded cockpit plane from Brooks Field, using only instruments for navigation. He flew 900 miles to Scottsfield, Illinois, becoming the first aviator in history to make a successful cross-country, instrument-only flight. In 1932, Ocker and Crane co-authored the world's first book on instrument flight called Blind Flight in Theory and Practice. This landmark book was used to support a curriculum they developed for training pilots in instrument flight. Ocker and Crane also collaborated on significantly improving flight simulation. Rudimentary flight simulation had been achieved through an antiquated Ruggles orientator that the Army mothballed in 1928. The Ruggles orientator had been used to test pilots' natural skills to physically upright themselves when they were inverted or turned sideways. The device did nothing to train pilots to cope with the problems of vertigo while flying in clouds. Crane developed instruments adapted for use on the Ruggles orientator, converting it into the world's first flight simulator. Ocker never realized his dream of seeing his ideas fully adopted by the Army Air Corps. He died at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. on September 15, 1942. The following year, the Army made instrument flight training mandatory for all pilots.
Except for Ocker's great zeal as a missionary, I doubt whether the course of blind flying would be required in the Army today. I believe that his campaign of education has had more influence in bringing about the use of instruments than that of any other person. Orville Wright.
Instrument flight that Colonel William Ocker pioneered took a back seat to the culture of pilot survival during the years preceding World War I. The prevailing belief then, among pilots, was that fate alone was responsible for fatal aircraft accidents. Aviation mishaps were believed to have been caused primarily by pilot error or aircraft mechanical malfunction. Few believed that flight's physiological and psychological effects had anything to do with the increasingly high death rate suffered by the military and commercial aviation community. World War I, however, provided corroborating evidence that flight conditions had a profound impact on pilot health and performance.
During the World War, it was learned that although the mechanism of the flying machine was of extreme importance, the mechanism of the human body was also of very great importance to flying. As a result, it was determined that certain physical or mental defects added to the hazards of flying. Colonel William Ocker.
Technological advances in aviation made during World War I allowed aircraft to operate at higher altitudes to avoid enemy anti-aircraft artillery. These advances created unintended consequences for air crews. It was called air staleness, a disorder defined by high altitude's effects on human physiology.
With the increase in the altitude at which flying is common, there has been a corresponding increase in the development of so-called air staleness among pilots. It is particularly the most experienced aviators who succumb to this disorder and become unable to fly at the necessary altitude. This is, of course, a matter of the utmost military importance, as it deprives the service of its best aviators. Dr. Yandel Henderson, Yale University.
Exposed to higher altitudes for longer periods, aviators experienced the incapacitating effects of air staleness, the loss of consciousness caused by oxygen deprivation. Only medical visionaries such as Dr. Theodore Lister believed that some aviators were physiologically predisposed to the air staleness disorder. Lister, a Michigan-born ophthalmologist, was the catalyst for a major shift in how the medical community evaluated flyers.
While the deficiencies in the plane have been extensively brought out, few realize that as much can be done for the pilot as has been done for the plane. Dr. Theodore Lister.
As aviation medicine's founder, Lister set the stage for subsequent marvels and discoveries that Army Air Service and later Air Force scientists would subsequently provide. The creation of aviation medicine was born out of Lister's unwavering commitment to pilot health and safety. The fledgling use of air power, Lister believed, would have inevitably faltered without resources and new ideas applied to pilot survival. He also knew that perceptions had to be changed during an era where few knew about the medical aspects of flying.
The average man felt that flyers, after a course of personal instruction, should go out and fly, and that would be all there would be to it. We all now know differently. Dr. Theodore Lister.
The problem, as Lister saw it, were the aviation exams. Inaugurated by the War Department in 1912, the exams were not specialized enough to determine the physiological and psychological aspects associated with flying fitness. Lister revised the exams in 1917 to establish pilot selection standards and refine aviator physical standards, with the goal of reducing aircraft accidents. The exams revision only solved part of a larger problem that became more apparent when 100,000 men volunteered for the Army Air Service during World War I. Lister had established physical examining units in 67 cities, but the examiners had no training in aviation special medical problems.
It has been learned that the development of certain defects or conditions, which are ordinarily considered as unimportant when found among the personnel of other branches of the service, may render an airplane pilot wholly unfit for the piloting of military aircraft safely. Consequently, there has been evolved, more or less gradually, a different set of physical requirements for the military aviator. General Malcolm Groh.
Lister fulfilled the need to train physicians in the new aviation medical specialty by creating, on September 26, 1917, the Air Service Medical Research Board at Minola, Long Island, New York. The board standardized aviator medical exams that supported a new pilot selection program. More importantly, the board led to the creation of America's first aviation research facility, when it became, on January 17, 1918, the Central Medical Research Laboratory. To the aviation community, it quickly became known as the Minola Lab at Hazelhurst Field.
It was originally Hempstead Plains and then Hazelhurst Field in 1917, and it was basically an Army training airfield during World War I. And the School of Aviation Medicine was founded there, the first Army Aero Service Medical Laboratory, and was very important because up till that time, there was no testing of aviators. They had to develop what would be the criteria to see if someone would be fit to be a pilot or not. So they developed the earliest tests, physical tests, mental tests, visual tests, to see if people would be acceptable as Army aviators. But it was really the establishment of it at Hazelhurst Field was really very important to the development of aviation, civil aviation too, just because so many early aviators needed early equipment, oxygen equipment, medical equipment, tests, and had to be done. And that was that first Air Service Medical Laboratory at Hazelhurst Field began all these very basic tests that continue to this day, ways to test aviators and equipment to keep them alive.
The Minola Lab was commanded by Colonel William Wilmer, a visionary ophthalmologist cast in the same mold as Lister. Dr. Wilmer's holistic approach to aviation medicine had a profound influence on the 18 officers who initially comprised the lab's 7 medical departments. Under Wilmer, the lab developed an extensive research program that focused on the causes and nature of pilot failure, from physiological or psychological conditions. Lab researchers also developed a method for determining maximum altitudes pilots can endure, a physical conditioning program that increased pilot tolerance to high altitudes, and enhanced scientific understanding of altitude sickness and hypoxia. The Minola lab became the War Department's primary aviation medical research center for studying altitude's effects on the human body. Central to the lab's high-altitude research was aviation medicine technology that included the Henderson-Pierce rebreathing apparatus. This device was used to examine the effects of oxygen deprivation at various altitudes on human physiology. Co-developed by Yale University physiologist Yandell Henderson, the apparatus gauged low oxygen's effects on vision and muscular and mental function. The Henderson rebreather also became the world's first diagnostic tool for cardiovascular function. The device was used in conjunction with other medical test equipment that lab physicians had invented. These devices became invaluable research tools used in visual acuity, fatigue, drug interaction, equilibrium, anxiety, and mental stress experiments. Minola lab research was further enhanced by a 4-ton low-pressure chamber. The steel chamber was the first of its kind in the U.S. and the largest of 3 that existed in the world when it was put into operation in February 1918. The chamber was later used during the 1930s by aviation pioneer Wiley Post for pressure suit experiments that simulated an altitude of 81,500 feet. The Henderson rebreather and low-pressure chamber tests on hundreds of pilots at Hazlehurst Field led to the development of altitude classification tests for aviators. These tests determined altitude tolerance ratings for all post-World War I military aviation occupations, ranging from pilots to artillery observers.
The results obtained show that a considerable percentage of the men who pass even the exacting medical examination required by the aviation service are unable to withstand altitudes even as low as 10,000 feet without exhibiting such physical or mental degradation as would seriously endanger a man piloting a plane. On the other hand, these tests reveal a small percentage of men who are naturally so resistant to low oxygen that they can withstand the equivalent of 20,000 feet without serious degradation, either mental or physical. Evidently, such men are specially fitted for work at high altitudes. Dr. Yandell Henderson.
The new medical standards for flyers that the Minola lab developed did more than simply rule out individuals with physical or psychological defects. The new standards also specified the minimal physiological limits beyond which flyers were rejected for flight duty. The Army Air Service recognized the importance of these standardized medical exams and early pilot classification as vitally necessary to aviator efficiency and safety. A tragic event at Hazlehurst Field confirmed the importance of Minola Lab's research contributions to pilot health and safety. The mishap also foreshadowed the need for the lab's eventual move to Brooks Field to provide medical care and guidance to flyers at the Army's primary flying field. Captain Resinati of the Royal Italian Flying Corps had built at Hazlehurst Field a new Caproni bomber that he planned to fly. The night before the test flight, Captain Resinati suffered sleeplessness caused by a chronic cold he could not shake. His sleeplessness worsened after he had taken 20 grams of aspirin. He also stayed out late dining. The next morning, on May 17, 1918, Dr. Wilmer urged him not to fly. Lab research had validated Wilmer's advocacy of adequate pilot rest and proper exercise, and his belief that pilots should be taken off flying duty prior to suspected physical or mental breakdowns.
It is absolutely essential that the pilot think and act quickly and accurately, for the man with the quickest reaction usually lives to tell the tale. Colonel William Wilmer.
Knowing that Colonel Wilmer had no authority to prevent him from flying his new plane, Rezanati ignored the advice of the Minola lab commander, boasting,
"Oh, that doesn't make any difference. I have flown so much I can fly just as well sick as well."
His claim elicited a stern warning from Wilmer.
"If I had the authority, I would remove you from flying until you were better."
Captain Rezanati did not relent. Airborne for less than a minute, the left wing of his plane tipped, striking the ground. The impact caused the bomber to topple over, crushing the pilot. Captain Rezanati's death led to Colonel Wilmer having subsequently received the authority to ground any aviator who wasn't physically capable of flying. More importantly, it provided further proof that pilot judgment can be impaired by a combination of factors. Such factors were at the heart of Lister's vision that led to the creation of America's first aviation medical research facility at Minola. He had been influenced by British wartime aviation fatalities and the appallingly high death rate from training accidents. A British study concluded that the majority of pilot deaths during World War I were caused by aviator physical defects and psychological disorders. Only 10% of aviation combat losses were attributed to pilot error. These results were substantiated by the British wartime practice of using infantrymen as pilots because of manpower shortages. None of them had been properly examined to determine whether they were physiologically or psychologically fit to fly. The British partly resolved this problem by establishing the Care of the Flyer program, predecessor to the flight surgeon concept that Lister had developed in Minola. In 1918, the standards for the selection and care of flying officers were rudimentary at best. There existed no physicians who had any practical knowledge of aviation. Lister resolved this problem by establishing, in June 1918, the Flight Surgeon School at the Medical Research Lab. The school produced America's first flight surgeons. Among them was Major William Ream, a Nebraskan and aviation medicine pioneer. Ream became the first Army medical officer to be put on flying status. Ream instinctively knew that by flying he could better understand the mental attitude of flying personnel. In a letter to his older brother Leon, Ream confessed his love for flying.
Up in the rarefied air, the exhaust of these powerful engines pound against your ears like the discharge from a battery of field guns. It is not unpleasant, aside from the biting cold of the air currents. The air at 10,000 feet is about zero, and when you rush through faster than the fastest wind, it bites like a knife. Major William Ream.
Besides the cold, Major Ream was also concerned about the medical treatment of aviators involved in aircraft accidents. Major Ream conceived the idea of placing first aid kits on airplanes, a practical innovation during an era where pilots often crashed far from medical facilities. Ironically, Ream's innovative idea did not help him survive a fatal crash in Illinois on August 24, 1918. Ream became the first flight surgeon in American history to be killed in an aircraft accident. By 1922, the School of Flight Surgeons and the Medical Research Lab had evolved into the School of Aviation Medicine, which today is the Air Force's oldest school. Dr. Louis Bauer, the school's first commandant, had by 1926 become the first medical director for the Bureau of Air Commerce, forerunner of the Federal Aviation Administration. As a result of Dr. Bauer's School of Aviation Medicine experience, he developed the first physical standards and medical exams for civilian pilots.
When the physical examination of civilian students became necessary, air accidents caused by students subject to fainting attacks or epileptic convulsions were obviated. In 1927, of civilian air accidents, 75% were in the case of unlicensed pilots, and 41% had never been physically examined. Dr. Louis Bauer.
Military pilot candidates, however, presented a unique problem to the Air Service. A trend had emerged at Army flying fields involving pilot candidates who had failed to learn how to fly for reasons other than physical defects. By 1926, this failure rate had peaked, with 87 out of every 100 pilot candidates washing out. The high washout rate contributed to the Army's decision to move the School of Aviation Medicine to Brooks Field in 1926. The move was a perfect fit for the school. Brooks Field was a logical venue for conducting aviation medicine research using young pilots and would-be aviators. The school's initiatives greatly contributed to the scientific selection and medical care of flyers. School of Aviation Medicine scientists discovered that the high flying cadet washout rate was caused by psychological defects. This discovery was made through the school's innovative complex coordinator, built in 1926. This device, a reaction time aptitude test, accurately predicted flying ability. It would eventually lead to the development of advanced neuropsychiatric and personality tests. By 1931, the complex coordinator test had validated its usefulness in predicting pilot candidates who were likely to fail to learn how to fly. The School of Aviation Medicine at Brooks Field pioneered the development of modern scientific methods of selection and classification of flying personnel. This resulted in an enormous savings in lives, property, time, and money, while also increasing aviators' safety, efficiency, and effectiveness. World War I flying ace Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, a frequent Brooks Field visitor after the war, recognized the importance of aviation medicine's role in helping enhance human performance.
It is plainly imperative that one keeps oneself always fit and clear-minded. It is a matter of life or death to every airfighter, this quick-thinking, unburdened mind. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker.
Since the dawn of human history, heroism has taken many forms. It has instinctively dwelled among men and women who shared a common understanding of its complementary parts: bravery, courage of conviction, and commitment to duty, honor, and country. However, for heroism to flourish, it requires conditions conducive to inducing sacrifice, adaptation, and innovation applied to the greater good of preserving life. These necessary elements all took root for over 90 years at Brooks Field. Brooks Field's contributions to the Allied cause during World War II validated the base's place in American military history as a venue for heroism. Emblematic of this virtue were Army Air Corps pilots who participated in the Doolittle Raid. 3 of the 80 Doolittle Raiders trained at Brooks Field for the daring operation against Japan. The operation, conceived and led by aviation legend Jimmy Doolittle, involved the unprecedented launch of bombers from an aircraft carrier. In April 1942, Doolittle and co-pilot Dick Cole led a formation of 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers that took off from the deck of the USS Hornet.